couldn't be a topic closer to my heart and the user interface and considerations about accessibility. So the idea of today's debate is I'm going to yield the floor to each one of you for a very small introduction about yourselves, the work you do in your parliament, and in case of Clive at the CPA. And after that, I have drafted a few proposed questions for each one of you. I will pose each question to one of you, and all the others will be able to share your thoughts and comments as well. So without further ado, allow me to start. I'm doing this alphabetically. So Chris, would you like to share a little bit about yourself and your work in the House of Commons and your relation to this topic?
Absolutely. Thank you, Luís. And like you, I resonate very closely with the user experience and user centricity of all things. And I'll start by explaining a little bit about why that is. So my role at the House of Commons here in Canada is I'm a director of our business products. So all applications, products of a digital sort that enable the business of our members of Parliament and their staff, and in turn, the citizens, the good Canadian citizens they serve, and intuitively the administration of the House of Commons who works through these products and services we provide to them. My background, which is very close to the user-centric approach in terms of digital product, is a background in computer science with business systems acumen. I've spent 20 years, the last great 20 years of my career here at the House of Commons in Canada, beginning with actually a focus on application development, actually creating many of the products that are still in circulation today, serving members. I've evolved into roles in enterprise architecture and most recently in product management. My early career focused on creating and maintaining and optimizing legislative systems. Our flagship product here at the House of Commons is branded as Prism. And the nature of a prism is a lot of light refracting and providing a brilliance of color and value, if I could create a metaphor. And that value is really around enabling members of Parliament in their legislative functional capacity. Just to kind of spell it out clearly, Prism is essentially capturing the interventions of our debates, whether they're in the House of Commons or in committees. We also then provide the transcription of the captured audio, leading towards the official publications of the House of Commons, and then richly providing the indexing, search, and reporting capabilities, which is really where the real value comes to the members of Parliament. Another notable system I've contributed to over the years is called LegisInfo. It's essentially where all of our legislation is housed in a digital format. So all of our bills, notably across the two houses of Parliament, so the Senate and the House of Commons, all of our legislation is housed in LegisInfo with a deep enrichment from the Library of Parliament, where a lot of research and great contributions are added to accentuate the value. The conversations that I've been focusing recently, as Luís teed up, have a lot to do with user experience, user interface, and most notably accessibility these days. So the real conundrum I have going forward is how can I transform a lot of our legislative tools to make them more accessible and in turn make them more consumable, relatable to, of course, members of Parliament, but ultimately the citizens they serve.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the introduction. Clive, would you like to share your thoughts about yourself, what you do in the CPA, and your relation to this topic?
Certainly, thank you, Luís. I'm a programs manager at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association based in Westminster. Those that are unfamiliar with the CPA, we are an interparliamentary association of 180 legislatures from across the Commonwealth's democracies at both the national and subnational level. We work to support those parliaments really in three areas. Those are the oversight of the executive branch of government, in reviewing budgets and investigating government ministries and agencies, etc., in their institutional autonomy, the control of their own resources and the separation within the separation of powers, as well as their institutional capacity, so their availability of support staff, frequency of their sittings and their facilities, etc. Most of our work comes under those three areas. Regarding my personal work within our projects division, it's split really between bilateral programs. We address with a particular parliament in our membership directly. Perhaps that might be tailored training programs for new parliamentarians following an election, or technical assistance programs on a particular issue that they might be experiencing. For example, guidance on how to spend funds on technology to support their processes and accessibility, as I'm sure we'll come on to. Outside of these bilateral programs, we have multilateral ones, which are the activities that relate to our advocacy networks. We have 4 of these, which address gender equality, support for parliaments in smaller Commonwealth jurisdictions, such as those in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, as well as youth engagement and disability rights. I coordinate our youth engagement activities and those of Parliamentarians with Disabilities Network, which aim to improve the accessibility of our member parliaments to citizens with disabilities. And it's from that experience that I'll be speaking from today. So really, in terms of how this topic relates to my role, it's very much an ongoing thing that I work on full time, and something that's been a real strength of our network has been direct support to parliaments on their facilities. That's all for me.
Thank you so much, Clive, for your introduction. Shirley, would you like to share a little bit about yourself and your relation to this topic?
Yes, so I'm the Director of ICT for Parliamentary Service, which is both for the staff and for the members of Parliament as well. We run a unicameral Parliament. So we take care of their ICT needs in their offices and in the offices on site, and we also take care of their ICT needs in the chamber as well. We also have various support for their we have an app which we are going to be demonstrating later, which demonstrates which gives an overview of everything that happens in Parliament. We also manage the technology as well. We have different units which manage the technology, a different unit which manages the applications as well. Previously, we have focused mainly on developing infrastructure, but now we are moving more into applications and then systems to make their work easier for them. It hasn't been that easy because in our environment, a lot of, especially the older members, are not very computer literate. So we really need to make sure that whatever we provide for them is easy to use so that they don't resist the introduction of new technology. Lots of them do complain, even though they're able to go on their phones. They complain that the size of the unit you have in the chamber are a bit small and stuff like that. I mean, I guess we'll get into that later. So, so obviously, in relation to this topic, we need to develop applications that are easier for them to use so that they will use them and not just complain and then go back to their old ways of doing things. We are trying very hard to get into a paperless parliament. We tried before, we introduced it, the speaker made, we reduced the number of order paper votes and proceedings we printed for a bit, but then there was a big complaints and the technology challenges, and then we went back to paper fully. So these are the things we are trying to sort out, make things easier for them so that they can adjust and then use the technology and go digital.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for your introduction as well. It's a pleasure for us to welcome the three of you in this particular debate. And without further ado, allow me to ask Clive the first question. Clive, let's consider the thoughts about the most common demand from legislative houses, both from MPs and staff. We know that the legislative digital transformation requires a deep understanding about the legislative process and the institution's history and traditions. Based on your experience at the CPA and as the coordinator for the network for parliamentarians with disabilities. What are the recommendations for colleagues in the technical staff to map the needs and demands from MPs to improve the accessibility and digital tools directly linked to their individual usage in exercising their parliamentary mandate? It means those tools that are not the chief of staff or the advisor that's using, but the MP that's directly using, for example, voting tools, any other tools that the MP is personally and directly using.
Thanks, Luís. And in answering this proposition, the first point that's sprung to mind was understanding, really. And I'd almost want to sort of invert the proposition a bit in saying that a deep understanding of digital transformation can both support the common demands of Parliament in passing laws and overseeing government expenditure, but can have the byproduct of improving the knowledge of the institution itself and addressing digital transformation along with any other theme that a Parliament considers, be it healthcare or education. When thinking of some of the headline issues in tech that we face in the world this year, from pass keys to post-quantum cryptography and very complex issues like that, I think if we want political systems that can adeptly respond to them, we're going to need politicians and staff that can understand and preferably respond to them, utilising first-hand experience, really. Which brings me on to training, I think, and how that can support the understanding. I think it's often the case that in parliaments you can find that there are staff who have a better understanding of some of the technologies that face them than even some of their counterparts within the parliament. But if that weren't the case, to definitely look to colleagues from their own region and to look to external training organisations from their own jurisdiction. And of course, as well as that, I would mention what we can offer at the CPA and what other international organisations can offer, and use this opportunity to promote our Parliamentary Academy, which is our learning management system on our website, which is accessible to all Commonwealth member parliaments, and is accessible to external parliaments who are interested in partnering with on it. And we've recently released courses in the last 2 years on really the breadth of parliamentary practice and procedure. But in the last year, in August last year, we released a course for our Parliamentarians with Disabilities Network on making parliaments accessible for persons with disabilities. This looked at the importance of accessibility, what it means for a parliament to be accessible in terms of its contribution to society, assessing whether your parliament is accessible, assessing communication strategies, and also scaling accessibility within the parliament to other democratic institutions. So I think training is a real headline issue for parliaments to consider, and something that I would definitely promote with that course and with wider training as a concept. I think consideration as well is another important value to have of persons with disabilities as stakeholders when implementing any IT measures, as I'm sure we'll come on to in some of the other answers about digital platforms and about accessibility strategies. I think from the outset, I'd want to set that considering persons with disabilities as primary stakeholders when implementing IT measures, from my experience, I think if you can make it inclusive to persons with disabilities, you can make it just as inclusive to those without at the same time. I think also awareness and openness is another important tenet for parliaments to have an understanding of. And when thinking of this, I particularly think of a visit that I made with a colleague in March 2020, just before lockdown, to the Welsh Parliament, which is a parliament in the United Kingdom of 60 members, soon to be 96, their next election in 2026. It's a state-of-the-art parliament building that they have that was built in 1999, with lots of state-of-the-art user interface systems. But what I want to mention today is some of the more lower hanging fruit and some of the more easier applications that they made there that I think are very replicable across the Commonwealth, such as Braille being used on all signs that they had, headsets available for persons with disabilities or persons with hearing impairments, even down to things like fonts and pointers on computers were made available for persons with disabilities as they had those in their chambers. They surveyed new members before like after they'd have an election, before they'd even take their seat, they'd have an acute understanding of their needs if they were a person with a disability. And another key aspect is before they'd even take their seat, they would make it clear that they wouldn't need to stand when contributing. They'd have the ability to contribute from a sitting position, which is less of a barrier, again, to persons with disabilities. And when thinking of these, I also thought of Dragon Naturally Speaking and Microsoft Dictate and some of those technologies that are very low cost, if not cost neutral with some of them, as softwares that are speech to text or speech to action even. I've used some of them myself before for getting minutes for meetings or for responding to emails. And I can usually talk quicker than I can type, so they're quite a convenient software that I think can be used. So again, looking at some of those more easier short-term gains, I think is another aspect. And finally, I would mention cooperation. I think it's perhaps predictable that a staffer from an interparliamentary associations body would do so. But I think a problem shared is a problem halved. And I would encourage any parliamentary staff from across the world to consider reaching out to other parliaments that might currently be looking at accessibility strategies or digital strategies, as they can offer solutions. Ourselves at the CPA, we have twinning programs between our Canadian and Caribbean branches, and also between our Australian and Pacific branches. Of course, in the two different regions, in either region, you can have different resource parliaments, but they generally find that they can both, it's a reciprocal relationship of what learning and development and what support they can provide one can be reciprocated. And I think that that's a great way of supporting one another. I would also mention some of the other services that we offer, such as our surveys that we do internally. We call these our Commonwealth Parliamentary Research Service, which allows external entities and any of our member parliaments to inquire with us about a specific area. We can then survey our other member parliaments to get a breadth of responses before providing them with those and helping to build a research base for that parliament to dip into as a service. So really, those are my key areas that I would mention, Luís. And yeah, thanks very much for this first question.
Thank you so much, Clive, for your considerations. Chris, would you like to share your comments on what Clive just said and on this question as well?
Absolutely. Clive really touched upon, I think it was a second tenet, something that resonates deeply with me is the awareness piece is first and foremost. As we've at the House of Commons here in Canada have been on our accessibility journey around enhancing the user experience, yes, of course, through user interfaces, as well as any other service rendering point. I've realized myself that I've been quite ignorant in a lot of the facts around accessibility, whether that be worldwide indicators or right here back at home in Canada. So I just took quick note of some key facts that I've been using across my teams from an initial sort of profound awareness statement. And what resonated with me was that 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability. And recent statistics across Canada and the United States is up to 25% of the population. So that's 1 in every 4 of us have a functional disability of some sort. And just during my tenure here at the House of Commons, I've served at least 5 members of Parliament who've publicly made their disability known. That's just the ones who've been willing to disclose such barriers for their effectiveness. So in response to a lot of this, Canada as a nation has crafted a legislation which is called the Accessible Canada Act. And it's a landmark federal legislation that aims to realize a barrier-free Canada by 2040. And in response to that, the House of Commons of Canada has devised its accessibility plan, which is initial 2023 to 2025 rendering, which has a core focus on some short, medium, and long-term goals to address these barriers. And Clive touched upon some of them. And certainly when you look at the spectrum of services we offer to members of Parliament, they can vary from, of course, the purpose of this conversation and debate today is around digital tools, but certainly the physical nature of things is an equally important aspect. And just some of the highlights from our plan here at the House of Commons is the culture change and training. Clive mentioned that in his second elements, how we affect employment, our entire built and physical environments, of course, information and communication tools, procurements, so for goods and services in our facilities, how we design and deliver programs, how we transport and bring members of parliament across our precincts. So a lot of these areas have certainly achieved some accessibility goals, but there are many ahead of us, hence a plan to get to a 2040 goal where all barriers are lifted for all disability types, allowing members of parliament and their staff, and in turn Canadians, to achieve their whole self in terms of delivering and receiving services. In terms of more specifically around the digital tools, the recommendations that I have for our technical staff here at home is to rethink from scratch how we build, design, deliver our products, not just kind of mid-stride or after the fact and address them bit by bit, is really start from the ideation process. So we've made a lot of achievements as many organizations in terms of the user centricity, is understanding your personas, the types of users who consume your services and your products. So right from that stage in terms of journey mapping, user-centric designs is understand the journey of users with disabilities meticulously, create products that are inclusive and accessible by design from the beginning. As Clive said, I'll say it a little differently. I deeply believe, and I live it every day, when I consume accessible products that were designed inherently for someone with a disability, is creating a more usable product for me as well, for all of us. So a more accessible product is a more usable product, bar none. User adoption and satisfaction are the ultimate metrics in digital product success. So if up to 25% of our users have barriers to use our products, that's a profound consideration. So that's what I leave this debate and conversation with in my thoughts is, how can we, from the beginning, continuously achieve and strive for better, more accessible and usable products?
Thank you so much, Chris, for your considerations. Shirley-Ann, would you like to share your thoughts on what the colleagues just said?
Yes, I think we as a parliament probably have a lot to learn from Canada and any other parliament which has a lot going for accessibility. Over here, we haven't actually had to support anybody who has maybe a disability like sight or needs Braille or anything. We haven't had to do that yet, but it's something that we did. We were looking at a few years ago when somebody who had a sight challenge actually was a candidate, but he didn't win the election. So, I mean, we haven't had to implement any accessibility like Braille and other things. We don't have any of that in-house. We probably have a lot to learn from you. However, we do have a television channel, and we do have the translation in sign language that we have. So at least if you are sighted and you are hard of hearing, you can have that. But we probably would like to do a little bit more and learn from the others so that we can build such things into the apps and the software that we put out for members of parliament. With the other general development of apps, for us, what has happened, as I said earlier, is that a lot of the time we have MPs complaining because they don't want to change. For instance, one thing we looked at was that we have a chamber system, and the complaint is that the screens are too small. So now we are thinking of acquiring bigger screens, which can easily from which they can read much better, bigger screens, so that they can read the systems there and then use the system so that we can move away from paper more onto the digital. We also have been trying to implement an e-Parliament project over the past few years. The problems we've had, and in this project means that we move away from paper. We would have our votes and proceedings and all parliamentary documents online. We've even provided the MPs already with the hardware to be able to access them, but we are still having a lot of challenges implementing the system, because the system was built by a consultant, and we're having some challenges, but we are working on that. So hopefully this year we will move more into the paperless environment and have MPs using their digital, accessing all their documents digitally. For instance, when it came to the chamber system, the system we have is a Bosch system, which is used in some other parliaments and which is being used effectively. However, for instance, a lot of the software that was inbuilt was not able to do the work that we required. For instance, if the speaker wanted to mute somebody because his or her time was up, it was a bit difficult. So we had to adjust that, and also we had to so that now when a member turns on his or her mic, after being recognized by the speaker, we have built-in other software capabilities. The MP's name, constituency, and things show up so that those watching on TV and the rest can see who is actually speaking, and are able to, the Hansard officers are able to identify them effectively for their transcribing of the debates. We've also implemented a single sign-on. That has been one of the problems we have when it comes to using the systems. We have our email system, our Active Directory, and other systems. We've implemented a single sign-on now, because a lot of MPs were getting fed up. Where's my password? You changed it for me last week. What's happening? And then they seem to think that we should be keeping their passwords in our heads. So when you come to me and you say, oh, I don't know, then it's in the IT officers' heads and they're supposed to change. So we've implemented a single sign-on. That has made it a bit easier. So now once you sign on to one system, you can access all the services we have now, including the email system, and every other system we have in-house. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Shirley-Ann, for your considerations. To close this round, I'd like to invite Clive, that was the first to answer, to make his final comments so we can close this round. Clive, would you like to share your final thoughts on this particular question and on what the colleagues just shared?
Certainly. In particular, I've just got a question for Christopher, if I may, if we have time. I'm sure we might come on to it. At the CPA, I'm always quite interested in federal-provincial relations, and I'm thinking very much here, in my experience with the Parliamentarians with Disabilities network of ours, someone who was a key figure in getting it off the ground following our first Parliamentarians with Disabilities conference in 2017 in Nova Scotia was their Speaker of the House of Assembly at the time, Honourable Kevin Murphy, who was their Speaker for years after and has now become a policy advisor to Honourable Carla Qualtrough, the Minister for Disability Inclusion in Canada. And I recall that he would have very interesting thoughts on support that Nova Scotia might need as a province from the federal government on disability issues during his time in Parliament, but then also seeing it from the other side, from going and working for a federal government minister. And I just wondered whether there's particularly any support that the House of Commons might have provided to some of the other provincial parliaments, or even just collaboration that it might have had with them on this area of accessibility or broader digital transformation.
Thanks for the question,
Chris.
Oh, sorry, Luís. I just jumped right into it. Yeah, Clive, great question. And Member Qualtrough, yes, she's been an outspoken, very passionate supporter of obviously the benefits and services that can be improved from an accessibility standpoint. And she herself, who is one of those consumers of services, has firsthand seen a lot of the let's call it the benefits that will speak at the House of Commons in terms of some of the improvements we've made for her service. And I have to give thanks and kudos to my colleagues who've gone the extra mile to really understand the barriers she faces on a day-to-day basis, from whether it's be predominantly a site-based barrier in vision. And that's how, in terms of our services, we've not just provided a blanket kind of interpretation of what would be the best solution for helping her consume our services. It's been a very custom and tailored experience. And we have wonderful colleagues who've gone, like I said, right in terms of investigations, follow-ups, continuous checkpoints and feedback with her to understand that. So I think what we've been seeing, as you mentioned, is as she represents the federal jurisdictions in some, let's call it provincial and perhaps even municipal type gatherings, is I'm sure she's been advocating for and communicating improvements and collaboration that could be gained at other levels of government. And I'm not privy to all the exact communications that transpired in Nova Scotia from a provincial perspective, but certainly I am quite aware that there are bilateral discussions that transcend the levels of government around topics such as accessibility. And more as it's become, as I said, a federal landmark legislation, certainly there's a trickle-down effect that is happening within our provincial and municipal layers of government. So it is still early days, I'll admit, in terms of our federal legislation at the House of Commons with our plan. It only just got tabled before Christmas 2022. So things are still fresh in that respect. And I just jumped on the opportunity to participate in this debate to take more learning and understanding myself of how we can help from a digital perspective, other layers of government. So I'll put myself out there to you guys, and I know Shirley-Ann did mention, I think, that she'd be interested in hearing a little more of our journey, and Clive, certainly we should connect around things that will happen, I'm sure, in the coming months in terms of bilateral discussions.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Clive, as well, for your question and comments. Shirley-Ann, allow me to bring the second question to you, if I may. We know the pandemic of COVID-19 in the past 3 years demanded the creation of digital spaces to replicate the dynamic of parliamentary activities virtually. However, it's also a known fact that many legislatures already had a robust digital transformation strategy. The colleagues here represented, for example. I'd like to ask about your insights on the main considerations when providing a new user interface for, one, colleagues in the technical staff, and two, the MPs. And my second question for you, Shirley-Ann, is how can we make these solutions, first, accessible, second, intuitive, and third, cost-effective for the Parliament?
Okay, so yeah, well, what we realize is that all virtual technologies, all virtual solutions need to have user interfaces that are clear, specific, and robust. And very importantly, the accessible and intuitive features must be present where necessary. So for accessibility, what we have done is that we ensure that live transcriptions and automatically generated closed captions in order for participants not to fall behind the conversation. And of course, to assist those who have hearing challenges. I've already noted that we have sign language interpreter. Another thing that is required for accessibility is font sizes that can easily be adjusted to suit the various people who want to use the system. And then keyboard shortcuts for users who may not want to use the mouse. We also have take care of screen readers, and then contrasting screen themes, whether it's dark mode, light mode, or whatever. And then also to take care of chats or virtual meetings. When it comes to voting, the clear and readable options, if it's not clear enough, so that people can make sure that they choose the option that they really want to do. Also good video quality, and especially when it comes to virtual meetings. And also the ability to mute attendees who were not speaking, to reduce background noise. And also allow a limited number of people, preferably one person to speak at a time, in order not to confuse the closed captions. When you're doing a virtual meeting, you're using the closed captions. We also think that the use of simple language for instructions, when we develop these apps or softwares, make it easier for people to use. When you have instructions that are 2 pages and in technical language, it makes it difficult for people to use them, and then they just give up and want their piece of paper back, so that they can read it as they've done always. We are not using text-to-speech yet, but it's probably something that we'll be looking at if we want to upgrade our Hansard system. What we have is we're using a VIQ, so they do the takes and then they go to and transcribe by listening to them. So maybe text-to-speech is something that we would be looking at to make it easier, since I've already heard that some of you are using that and it's working very well. When it comes to the intuitive, how we can make systems more intuitive, we think of the use of common user elements that users are familiar with, maybe things that they are using on their phones. If anything they can do on their Android or iPhone, they should be able, if it's built into a system, then it makes it easier because it's already something they're already using. And if it is labeled easy, if the labeling is self-explanatory, then it makes it easier for them to use. And also seamless efforts to join meetings. For instance, okay, these waiting rooms and stuff, but then at least if they have secured access, and they have their username, their password, so that they're able to access it easily. Well-recognized self-explanatory icons and images should also be used. And also should be easy to install. Tutorials to explain features that are not obvious. That comes down to maybe training or to users on the use of the systems, so that they get a feel of what is actually supposed to be done, and they do it in the training environment. Once they are comfortable, when they move into the user environment, then they are better off. Another thing is to avoid cluttered user interfaces. There are so many things, people get confused because they don't know what they want to do. And that would make unnecessary information may overshadow relevant ones. It also needs to have easy to navigate menus, and user interface and task flow should be similar across different functions. Basically, the accessibility features implemented in digital solutions, which will make such solutions usable by everyone, including people with disabilities. So basically, that's what we think. And then we've already talked about the use of sign language, and also Braille, which I've already mentioned that we may like to learn from others. So these are the things that would, when it comes to cost effectiveness, I guess if it's a project which is being implemented and the systems are already structured such that the cost is built in upfront, then of course, once it's a project, the value of the project to Parliament, you see it as, if it's cost effective, then it's something that we probably go through a process, we do evaluation, we have a budget, we do evaluation, and then whatever solution we choose would be based on our budget, and then based on the fact that we may be able to use it for the length of time. Maybe if we have a 5-year, long-term, short-term cycle, then we know that, okay, we've got this system, we can use it for 5 years, we can upgrade it in the next 2 years, and then maybe at the end of its life, we would have built up another budget to implement or to upgrade or to get something which is maybe more modern, because with technology, we know the changes so fast, then there are new things very regularly. So if you're not careful, you end up always changing your main system instead of just upgrading if you don't look at the budget. So yes, that's what I have for now.
Thank you so much, Shirley-Ann, for your considerations. Chris, would you like to comment on that?
Absolutely, lots of great items that Shirley-Ann brought forward, and the one that resonates most with me is the age-old balance of cost versus value, and in this case, value being a more intuitive, more accessible product for our constituents. So just in terms of the question is asking around digital transformations, and yes, notably, the House of Commons is still mid-stride, as most organizations in their digital transformations. Ours, in its latest flavor, began in 2019, and we've been quite successful in delivering quite a few outcomes. Now, enter the accessibility elements of requirements and compliance, and that kind of throws some elements not into a spin, but let's just say an adjustment of how we are going to continuously deliver a digital environment that's going to, yes, be cost effective, but most importantly, add that value. And if this new value metric is around an accessible, intuitive, and usable product, well, what considerations should we take into account? So the first question I'll bring is to our colleagues and our technical staff. What resonated with me is, as Clive mentioned, and I'll mention again, is the awareness and the training and the process reforms of really what is ahead of us in terms of compliance and non-functional requirements we must achieve in terms of that we won't get them as requirements from our business stakeholders, but they're elements of the legislation and the compliance that we must build in from the beginning. And this was what I recommend in terms of our delivery practices, whether they be DevOps, Agile, Waterfall in nature, is really infiltrating these processes to make sure that accessibility, once again, is not an afterthought, but ingrained throughout the SDLC, System Development Lifecycle. So what I also recommend is in terms of quality assurance and other processes. So it's great that our folks, our developers, our architects build those from the beginning, but that second pair of eyes is always a very useful element in terms of inherent quality. And if I place accessibility as a quality metric to ensure we have compliance for, well, obviously that should bring to bear in our QA processes. And last but certainly not least, the final say is how does it look in production? Is routine compliant audits are necessary, of course, to hold ourselves accountable and to build in the right remediation efforts if things were missed throughout our checkpoints. So the last thing we've resonated a lot in our most recent transformation is the collaboration aspect. So communities of practice across your teams to ensure those silo breaking activities are commonplace, so that the way accessibility and the requirements are being implemented are done uniformly in an efficient manner. So you bring your practitioners from across the organization and apply them into these communities, if you will, to share and learn together. As it pertains to our customers, our clients, members, and their staff, to demonstrate the value, communication campaigns will be very effective in terms of showcasing stepwise improvements, agile sprints, deliveries in terms of those gains that they can benefit from often, not just monolithic releases of accessibility improvements once a year, but continuously. What kind of little tips, tricks, improvements, barriers have we removed for them? And in terms of the agile mindset, feedback. So surveys, focus groups, voice of the customer really resonate in ensuring that what we're doing is it transmitting into value for our members of Parliament? Because once again, a more accessible product is a more usable product. In terms of the interfaces that we design, inclusive design and user-centric design go hand in hand with accessibility. So whether they be visual, cognitive, or simplistic elements we can adjust in our UIs to make them more usable. What are those low-hanging fruit? What are elements that are more complex? Again, it comes back to cost and value. And if I finish with cost effectiveness, it starts with bringing the culture to bear into the mix and the practices and processes of the organization at large. So inherently, accessibility can never be an afterthought. It has to be part of the way we live and work every day. And efficiency will come via deep integration into our practices and processes. And most importantly, what I'll close with is that fine-tuning those costly elements and continuously reevaluating the value they deliver and focusing on a constant measure of value versus cost in how we prioritize the laundry list, the long list of remediation and rectification that we have to do for accessible environment is really, I think, the best approach is continuously grooming a backlog of accessible features and requirements that we need to continuously deliver. And by 2040, I think we'll be in good shape if we follow a recipe like that.
Thank you so much, Chris, for your considerations. Clive, would you like to share your comment on what the colleagues just said?
Certainly. There's some areas that I'd add to a digital strategy. Certainly, starting with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAGs, as they're referred to in shorthand. Some of our most successful work at the CPA in technical assistance with parliaments has been done through parliaments carrying out audits or self-assessments, looking at a criteria, comparing themselves against it, finding where there are gaps, where there needs to be improvement, but also areas where they're already achieving what's really desired. And I think that these web content accessibility guidelines that were established in the late 90s by the World Wide Web Consortium as standards for ensuring that online communications are accessible to persons with disabilities, but also even other users that are constrained by the device that they access an online communication in, for example, mobile phones, I think is a really good way of measuring yourself as an institution. Some suggested guidelines are as basic as just not having coloured backgrounds beneath text for persons with sight impairments. or explaining natural language, as Shirley-Ann touched on. But some go to even more advanced guidelines that are more demanding, such as having sign language options for video content, so parliaments can really benchmark themselves against these as a form of evaluation. I think obviously the main area that a parliament can do this on and work on is its own website. And I think that has to be demand driven, touching on Christopher's point about feedback, I agree is so important. Ourselves as the CPA, if you go on our website, you will find that it can be narrow at some parts. If you're going onto it on a desktop computer, that's very much because we designed it based on mobile use. That was what we found, that most of our stakeholders and audience, that's the main device that they access our website on. And I'd add, in terms of the feedback, just one extra group in particular that I find is so useful, which is organisations of persons with disabilities. For our Parliamentarians with Disabilities Network, we engage a lot with the Commonwealth Disabled People Forum, I should say, which is an organisation of persons with disabilities organisations across the Commonwealth. They're in 48 Commonwealth countries, and having that immediate base of audience that can point out where parliaments need to improve is really good, because obviously this session is about the accessibility of persons with disabilities to Parliament, but that goes both ways. Parliament itself can often use the excuse of not being able to access persons with disabilities as readily as possible for feedback, but organisations of persons with disabilities give them that representative body to get that feedback from. I'd also touch on, just quickly, on some pointers on social media. As we've mentioned, the sort of cost-effective need for some of these measures. Some of the demands in the WCAGs are on captioning images and graphics, but also posting subtitles in videos. We ourselves do video editing very, very regularly at the CPA and use Adobe Premiere Pro. It has its own auto-generating subtitles software now, automatic captions. So do live streaming services like YouTube, even Zoom has it now. Some of these are very, very low cost and low-hanging fruit that can be used without having to pay for a complete separate service. And finally, I would mention, as some of these have been more short-term and more immediate, some of the more long-term aspirational points, as Christopher touched on, their goal of 2040 in Canada, looking through their accessibility plan from 2023 to 2025, particularly interests me under the ICT section is those long-term accessibility plans in assistive technologies, in particular, visual, auditory, and peripherals as they break them down. Things like Braille printers and sort of rolling out screen readers and things like that, I think are really, really good measures that are really aspirational in achieving a better level of accessibility for the institution. So those are the main ones that I would mention, really, Luís.
Thank you so much, Clive, for your considerations. To close this round, Shirley-Ann, would you like to share your final considerations on this topic before we move to the next question?
Yes, so I just like to focus, especially, Christopher made a comment that accessibility can never be an afterthought. And I think I like that very much. It's for us, it has been an afterthought all along. And I think it's something that we seriously have to work into our processes and not wait until we have somebody who needs who needs accessible access before we do it. So that's my takeaway from this session. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shirley-Ann. Allow me to bring my last question of today's debate to you, Chris. Considering the digital platforms already existing in Parliament and the necessity to implement or improve their accessibility, what are your recommendations on the main elements that the team responsible for this kind of project should be aware of? It's a question that directly links to our debate in this morning, because the colleague from the US, Mark Stoder, he was mentioning the challenge of integrating new legislative systems to old legacy systems that are 20, 30, 40 years old. So how can you consider what we are discussing here today in a reality of old legacy platforms that many parliaments are still using?
Yeah, this was my favorite question, I'm going to admit, Luis, because it allows me to get my hands a little more dirty, roll up the sleeves, if you will. It's my bread and butter of what I've been working on for the last 20 years. So I have lots of considerations to share with the debate here. The first I'll mention is absolutely, you nailed it, is there's a lot of legacy. There's considerable investment made in digital platforms at the House of Commons of Canada, I'm sure across many parliaments, if not all. And I think the best way to break this question down, the complexity, into at least two major sections, two pieces, is let's consider a little more toward the legacy side first, which tends to, in our case, be our custom application development platform. So back when I started working at the House of Commons of Canada, you couldn't go and buy a legislative digital platform. We had to handcraft it, and had significant amount of manual creation using very, let's say, high code platforms to build these platforms. So we're dealing with, in terms of a system that I mentioned, a flagship product called Prism, and from a web perspective, Legisinfo. These products have been life cycled already, just to let you know, at least 3 times. They've gone through 3 major product life cycles of basically being rewritten. And we're at really the precipice of the 3rd major life cycle, where a lot of things are being considered now in terms of what's available to us in 2023 and beyond, in terms of composable architecture, buying a little more versus building, integrating. But certainly this is a long road ahead of us in terms of moving the footprint into something that's a little more acquired versus built. And so we've got a journey in terms of, as I've been mentioning all along, quite a few accessibility requirements that must be met in the short, medium, and long term. And therefore, more latitude is going to be needed in terms of fitting up our aging platforms, especially Prism, in terms of a custom application development platform, to fit them up for very costly accessibility requirements. I simply, in our team, cannot pass these costs on all at once to the organization. That would be viewed very unfavorably. Shirley mentioned budgets and ensuring you fit within your budget. Well, that's where creativity, and I'll give a nod to our transformation in terms of adopting a product-centric approach, is we're now in command in terms of the roadmaps, in terms of the life cycle, in terms of how we will decommission and stand up and bring to bear renewed versions of the products we've already built on these platforms, and how we can, when we're doing that, instill, just like I mentioned, not as an afterthought, but from the beginning, the accessibility requirements that when we rebuild these products or recompose them, that they're going to be accessible from the beginning. So this is, as you can imagine, from a custom app development platform perspective, a much longer journey. And we're really using our roadmaps to communicate these timelines, work with our business partners in procedural services, in our office of the law clerk, et cetera, around how together we'll transform the business elements and the product elements over that time horizon. Now, the good news is our roadmaps are in a state to achieve accessibility compliance well before 2040. But I would say this is our greatest challenge at the House of Commons, is our custom development platforms. As I switch to the next gear around vendor provided, or let's say more cloud dominant types of platforms, digital platforms, which we've shifted quite a few of our business processes and products towards as over the last 5 years. Immediate conversations with our account management teams and our vendor perspectives, even their engineering teams, in terms of what accommodations and compliance will be required of them. Bringing our procurement and legal teams into the spectrum to negotiate compliance requirements, as we either modify existing contracts we have with our vendors, or to decide that there's simply too much friction in to achieve some outcomes in new requirements for new tenders, for new procurement requests for proposals, to ensure that our compliance requirements are, again, not an afterthought, but built from the beginning in the requirements we put out to the market. And if I break down our platforms that are more of the software as a service, even platform as a service perspective, we have adopted quite a few low code, no code, RAD or rapid application development platforms. Certain things like dynamic CRM, ServiceNow, Microsoft SharePoint come into mind in terms of some of these that we've really leveraged. We're seeing more and more a lot of configuration and latitude for us to amend user interface elements, which is great. So we've seen these platforms themselves with these major vendors become more accessibility conscious and become more enabling us as customers to perform those great configuration changes that we must make. So it's wonderful to see that in the vendor community, that they are taking this very seriously too, as it is a federal landmark legislation here in Canada. So to do business in Canada by 2040, all of these vendors will need to. The most difficult area I see right now is less to do with the low code, no code platforms, but more in the where we're assembling and composing third-party products as they are, especially if they're cloud or SaaS in nature. So I think the biggest challenge and opportunity there is to understand and assess the limitations of each of these products. Do perform an accessibility fit gap, if you will, of the existing landscape you have with your existing third-party products. You may be forced to shop around, and as I mentioned before, around procurement, working with policies to ensure that, hey, this product that we're using, we've had a conversation with the vendor, there's a much longer time horizon for them to become compliant. How does that fit with my plan, with our plan in our organization? Are we aligned, or do we have too much of a difference between us and something must change? So where I'll finish with everyone and open the floor is I believe that the homogeneity and of providing a seamless service experience for our customers, members of Parliament and their staff is paramount. So as we assemble high code, low code, third-party acquired products to provide a seamless service environment that is accessible, we as technology providers must ensure that we understand that landscape and that we're able to advocate and build into our plans well in advance to roll out these changes to be compliant, of course, to any legislations you may have around accessibility. But at the end, it's all about a more usable, enjoyable product for our entire community of users.
Chris, thank you so much for your considerations. Shirley-Ann, would you like to comment on what Chris just said about this question?
Yes, I think Chris has virtually covered everything. I don't really have much to add. But I think that he kind of covered everything by looking at the various kinds of software, whether it's in-house built. And I find it interesting that you started off with everything, most of your software, you build them in-house from the scratch. Whereas for us, we started more with the off-the-shelf products. And then with time, when we built up the capacity, then we came in-house and started developing software in-house, because even from the beginning, even our website was built by a contractor. And then now we kind of brought it in-house, and then we're doing it ourselves. So I find that interesting that you started in-house and are moving, and maybe doing both now. So well, I think we still have a lot to learn. So I'll hand it over. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shirley-Ann, for your considerations. Clive, would you like to share your comments on what the colleagues just shared?
Certainly, I would. When reading the proposition, the word aware of really struck me for a team responsible of implementing a project to improve accessibility. What should they be aware of? And it struck me as risk in a way, and what sort of risks they should be mindful of, and how they can sort of respond to those. At which point I couldn't really look beyond one of the main risks that sticks out to me currently in the Commonwealth in digital transformation, which is obviously Wi-Fi accessibility across the globe and across the Commonwealth. Speeds can vary really wildly across our member parliaments. In Singapore, for example, the average download speed is around 80 megabits per second. Some other sub-Saharan African countries, it can be below 10 megabits per second. It doesn't necessarily correlate exactly with the parliaments in the corresponding jurisdictions, but obviously there's a need for investment there. At the CPA, when we communicate with certain regions like the Pacific, we're very mindful of the size of an email message that we might be sending, because the capacity can be as limited as 5 or 10 megabytes for sending an email. So almost no images can be received on a server in some of these jurisdictions. But I have been really impressed with how optimistically some jurisdictions respond to it, keeping in mind the Pacific. I know that in the Parliament of New Zealand, colleagues who work remotely, as they needed to at some times in the last couple of years because of COVID, rely on a government-supported VPN to support them when there are issues with home Wi-Fi. In South Africa, we currently have a colleague at the CPA in Cape Town, and she's utilised data dongles as a way of accessing mobile networks through the issue of load shedding that they've had recently quite badly. And for those that are unfamiliar with load shedding, it's been an issue in South Africa since 2007, where they have these national electricity blackouts due to insufficient generation of capacity with electricity. So it's a real issue that's affected their federal and provincial parliaments. Devices are another sort of area for perhaps risk that I would encourage us to be aware of. In obviously, parliamentarians having access to digital platforms via their mobile on the go or via a tablet in a meeting, I think is obviously ideal. But when I look at a parliament like the UK Parliament, I think that they do excel quite well at having a clear delineation between personal and professional emails, which I think is quite important as members go from backbenchers to ministerial positions. Obviously, you can have conflicts of interest. The counter argument to having such a delineation is the cost implication of having better servers, having better parliamentary email addresses, but it just shows the real need for that in delineating between the two. And finally, I would mention harnessing browser technology for accessibility. Christopher's talked about SharePoint, and I think that with most cloud-based data management platforms, they are primarily used via internet browsers. And when thinking about accessibility for persons with disabilities, it's a good opportunity to signpost some of the features that browsers have for accessibility, like text-to-speech. And even in SharePoint, I've been delighted to see that they've got immersive readers now, that you can click on a PDF, get the plain text version, and click play and have it read to you, which is a really, really great way of making them accessible. So those are the 3 points that I would add, Luís.
Thank you so much, Clive, for your considerations. Chris, would you like to close this round with your final considerations?
Absolutely. Final thoughts, Shirley-Ann. Although I may have covered a lot of ground, you brought an interesting point that I think you should really leverage as a strength. And you mentioned we kind of did things in inverse a little in terms of how we've approached our delivering our digital products. And I would use to your advantage the lighter footprint that you have in terms of technical debt and custom built platforms and code with your teams, and really leverage, let's say, life cycle management as you work with your vendors and renew contracts, or let's say add new vendors and products into the mix. Is focus on your UI accessibility requirements very carefully. Understand what you need as an organization, what goals you must achieve, and ensure that those are present from the beginning in your vendor management practices. So when it comes to a tender, a request for proposal, again, it's not an afterthought. It's very clear about the expectations, and amend them as things go by and you learn about your clientele and the needs that you must offer. And Clive, I think the key thing that resonates is you've had the benefit of working with many stakeholders in parliaments, and you've really seen those best practices in action, and most notably the success stories for folks like us to learn from. So I think you just named a few that sound like I could pick your brain for at least half an hour on each, just to learn a little more. So that's how I'll close this little question, Luís. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We are reaching out, sadly, the end of our debate today. Before we go, I'd like to yield the floor back to each one of you if you have any final thoughts for 1 or 2 minutes, so we can close this session. I started alphabetically. Now I'm doing the same way, but on the opposite way. So I'll start with Shirley-Ann. Shirley-Ann, would you like to share any final thoughts on today's debate?
Yes, so my final thoughts are things I've already mentioned, that we have not done much in terms of making sure accessibility is built into our apps. And so for me, this is an eye-opener and something that we need to look at more closely as we develop more apps and software in-house. So for me, my takeaway from this conference is that we need to look more closely at accessibility and not just focus on what we are doing so far, which is on our television channel, and we have accessibility. But then also another thing maybe we could look at is the Braille, maybe developing products, order paper, votes and proceedings, and official reports into Braille for people who use Braille, so that it's easily accessible. So that's one thing you may be looking at as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley-Ann, for your final considerations. Clive, would you like to share your final thoughts on today's debate?
Certainly. I would keep it short and reiterate the importance of considering persons with disabilities as stakeholders in all of this. The saying is nothing about us without us, and translating that to Parliament IT services, I think is best done by considering that if a service is accessible for persons with disabilities, it will be accessible for other users the same, if not more so. Also to consider that if your Parliament doesn't currently have any members with disabilities, or if your staff department doesn't have persons with disabilities, perhaps look at what barriers might be preventing those people from entrance and consider how you can mitigate those issues. With that, back to you, Luís.
Thank you so much, Clive. Chris, would you like to close today's debate with your final thoughts?
I'll make it even shorter. A more accessible product is a more usable product. A more usable product is a more successful product. That's it.
That's a perfect sales pitch. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for your participation. Thank you, Clive. Thank you, Shirley-Ann. It was a very interesting debate. I'd like to invite all of you to stay connected. In 10 minutes, Shirley-Ann will start her presentation about the modernization case in the Parliament of Ghana, and specifically about their app, the Parliamentary Watch. She will make a presentation alongside Mr. Daniel Mensah from the Parliament. So we're going to have this small break, and then we are going to proceed with her presentation. So you are all welcome to stay and to participate as well. And obviously, I see you have much to share. So if with your permission, I'm going to connect all of you after this conference, so you can continue this dialogue afterwards. So thank you so much.